So if you can't tell, I am very sick today, so my voice is gonna sound weird. I'm sorry. Fear. The human mind. How do we manipulate it as storytellers to make things scary? Hi Pinkies! Welcome to another Storytime Saturday. So a lot of the time when we talk on Storytime Saturdays about things that are scary or villains and narratives, a lot of the time we talk about this idea of survivalist beliefs. If we look back on humanity's history, we can look at what things were scary from a survival standpoint and use those things to create compelling villains and conflict in a story. When I watch critiques of stories like movies and TV shows, sometimes people will say there's not enough drive, there's not enough conflict, there's no clear villain, and because of that there's not a lot of tension in the story. I think this can be a valid criticism, but I also think it's very interesting that the human brain really wants a villain to drive a narrative. As humans, we look for patterns in everything, and a story that has a clear narrative structure is a lot easier to follow and better for us to wrap our minds around. If there's a clear villain to run away from, your brain can really buy into a concept and even bond more to the heroes of our story. This is why in Godzilla movies, oftentimes our main characters don't have much characterization, because you really don't need all that much to bond with them. They're already running from this creature that's so otherworldly that you have to root for them. The other reason they put big actors in Godzilla movies is because they don't want to pay royalties to CGI companies who animate Godzilla, because people really go to see him, not these big name actors, but that's a whole nother thing. So let's examine Godzilla for a minute. Godzilla is one of the best monsters that we've created as storytellers. From a design standpoint, he's so iconic. He is everything that scares us as humans. He's a reptilian creature, which reptiles are the furthest away from humans you can pretty much get, while still recognizably scary to the human eye. At the same time, he makes us feel small. Usually, as humans, we're used to being in a world where everything is us-sized, and when we're out of our own world and Godzilla is really the big thing, we're just these little ants to him. It's scary, it's off-putting. At the same time, Godzilla is conflicted. It's a character that's, depending on which version, he's not necessarily evil. The MonsterVerse has this great way of balancing out the destructive nature of Godzilla while also making him almost a deity. In a lot of ways, he's acting in place of Mother Nature. He's very much Mother Nature's knight, if Mother Nature was the queen. We'll call it that. So what are some other villains that we love? Voldemort, Darth Vader, Grendel, because I'm always gonna bring things back to Beowulf. If you don't like it, leave the channel. All of these villains have a few things in common. 1, dehumanization. 2, darkness, and 3, intrigue. Grendel very much is like a proto-Godzilla in a lot of ways. He's bigger than our main characters. He's this inhuman creature. There's not a lot of description of him in the book, but he has hair, and then in some spots he's hairless. So he's got this patchy look to him. I think this is a good way to make him non-human while using the idea of the time that, how many of them were really seeing alligators or dragons, who knows. There's also this intrigue, what is the nature of Grendel? Is this a real thing that existed? Because there is at least some truth to the narrative of Beowulf. We think that Beowulf was an actual person. How much of the story is true or exaggerated is up for debate. If we look at Voldemort, he's a little overrated in my opinion. Voldemort has this same dehumanization going on. His nose is flattened or almost gone, so he has these sort of snake nostrils, which is a really good way to sort of make him unappealing to the human eye. He has this great accent and voice to differentiate him and make him seem evil. But there's not a lot of conflict to him. There's not a lot of, ooh, I wish we could turn him good. He just is this evil, mustache-twirling villain, which is not a bad thing. He serves his purpose. If we look at Darth Vader, there's something really interesting going on. By using a mask, George Lucas has completely taken the human nature out of him. Even Darth Vader's cape sort of hides his human shape in some ways. This all works to George's advantage when the redemption of Darth Vader happens, getting to take off his helmet and seeing everything. We finally get to connect with him in a way, and his sort of weakness in that moment helps us connect even closer. So this brings me to why I made this video. Part of why I made this video was watching The Orville. The Orville is very similar to Star Trek if you haven't seen it, but the thing about the Orville that really had me thinking was the idea that the world keeps getting smaller. As humans, in storytelling, the world keeps getting more and more explored to the point where now only the oceans are really unexplored and we're already making our way into space. There's not a lot of fear of the unknown. A lot of our fears have sort of been put onto each other. We don't really worry about dragons or serpents under the sea. We're more worried about demonizing each other and sort of making conflicts up. I'm not going to get too political now. Sorry, I realized I was going a certain way. But as storytellers, this presents a new problem for us. How do we make things scary when everything nearly is explored? Lost, I think, does a really great job of this by putting all of the characters onto this mystical island that is completely unexplored. Everything has this mystique and intrigue to it. Even by the end of the series, the entire island and its true nature is not clearly explained. It's very much unknown, and every new character we're introduced to has this bit of like, can we trust you? Even the original cast is like, man, any of these people could have been these island dwellers who are ready to kill you. It's really great at like scaring you and creating this mistrust around every corner. I think space shows like The Orville and The Mandalorian have this great tool of the galaxy at their disposal. This galaxy could be completely unexplored, not to mention the sort of ship tensions, right? If you're on this ship, what if you run out of fuel? What if somebody on your ship is secretly a spy or evil? There's a lot of these great opportunities that I think you could draw on from old sailors. Read a lot of their writing, and I think you could probably make something pretty beautiful. This is getting a little unorganized, so let's put it back together here. As a storyteller, these tools are so valuable to us. To make a compelling villain, there's a lot of factors, but I think some of the most important ones are 1, creating a mysterious character. This character can have some human elements to them, but I think dehumanizing them in at least one way, physically, will help us sort of establish in our brain that they're not super trustworthy. This idea is a little bit problematic if you think about it, but I don't think we're going to run into somebody who looks like Darth Vader in real life anytime soon, so as long as you're creative with it, I don't think it's a problematic idea. The next item is darkness. I think there's a lot of movies these days that don't rely on darkness near as much as they should. If we look at Jurassic Park, a lot of the reason that the CG in that movie looks so good, even though it's some of the first CG ever, is because it's so dark. If you watch any good horror movie, the villains and the sort of creatures and monsters will be shrouded in darkness, and because of this, our human minds will fill in the gaps. Arrival is really great at this because it has this foggy glass between our protagonists and the aliens on the other side. We have to kind of assume, based on just corners of the aliens, what they look like. This is really brilliant, and I don't expect you to go that deep for your villain, but that brings us to our final category, which is conflict. Now, a villain can be mysterious. Obviously, you need to create a little bit of stakes. Maybe he kills a character, maybe he kills a village of characters we don't really know. Whatever the case, with your villain, you need to create a teeny bit of conflict. Now, this isn't always necessary, especially when the villain is not the villain. One of my favorite kinds of stories is a story where there's a villain character and they're built up to be sort of lame. I recently read this comic book series and it wasn't extremely good, but one of my favorite parts of it was that it was really a man versus author story, which is something I've never read before. But in the first issue, it set up this conflict between this character who's more of a rebel type and his father, who's this mega corporation head, and he sort of owns the world, and he's searching for his son who's doing these mischievous hacking activities. By the second and third issue, the father is hardly in it at all. The author sort of takes off the mask and tells you straight up that the son is a representation of him and his father's a representation of the father in the book. The conflict stops being the father. It's a man versus self conflict. These sort of stories are so interesting because you can take a nothing villain. Everything Everywhere All at Once does this as well, where the daughter of our main character is kind of the villain, but in a way, she's not. Your villain doesn't need to have extreme depth, and I think characters like Thanos have convinced modern writers that, it's really important to have some growth with your villain, to be able to relate to them in some way. I don't think this is always true, especially when you're really wanting to focus on the main drive of your main characters. Sometimes the villain doesn't need to have any nuance at all. Like anything in writing, there's a million ways that you could take a villainous character and darkness and the unknown as a concept and just sort of do it anyways. But I think we're in this perfect modern era where as the world gets bigger, it also gets smaller. I think as humans, we're always going to have this fear of the unknown. It's our job as writers to create the new unknown, to create a new area for our readers to get into and to really be afraid, be intrigued. Whatever type of story you're writing, remember that the unknown is extremely important to you because you can use it to create all sorts of mystique and intrigue around your story. As with all of these videos, there was a lot of rambling, but I hope you enjoyed that one, and that's it. Bye, Pinkies!